Hello, Why Religion friends. John Hilton here. I want to start out today with a little quiz. True or false? In general, people who marry in their late 20s have better marriage outcomes than those who marry in their early 20s. Second question, true or false? In the United States, when you get married, the odds of you getting divorced are 50%. Last question, true or false? Studies show that, in general, religious marriages are the happiest marriages. Now, I don't want to give away all the answers, but here's the answer to that last question.
We did a study in 11 countries with 16,000 people looking at the impacts of religious practice on marriage and family life. Most studies only look at whether people attend church, right? You're highly religious if you go to church once a week. We went past that, not just attenders, but what a group we called home worshipers, who actually were praying on a daily basis, reading scriptures regularly, having religious conversations in the home, praying together as families. We found that the benefits of religion in people's lives was 30 to 40% higher than most studies estimate. And all the studies have shown that highly religious, right? So that's a great starting factor. Our faith matters, right? Religious practice matters. Those are more resilient, more enduring marriages.
Prophets have taught that marriage between a man and a woman is ordained of God. Today, we'll be exploring what current research tells us about marriage and its benefits. I'm your host, Professor John Hilton, and this is Why Religion.
Each year, religion professors at Brigham Young University produce hundreds of publications on subjects related to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. This podcast brings this research into one place to enlighten the everyday seeker of truth.
Seek learning, even by study and also by faith.
Interviewing the author, we discuss why the study was done, why it matters, and why the professor chooses to be both a scholar and a disciple. This is Why Religion. Research to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith in Jesus Christ.
Today, we get to hear Brad Wilcox interview his colleagues Jenet Erickson and Jason Carroll about some of their recent research, including the Utah family miracle. Doctors Erickson and Carroll will share the answers to the questions I began with, as well as much, much more. I'm excited for this discussion. Let's dive in.
I have been so excited for this interview because it's about a topic that's near and dear to all of our hearts, and that's the family. Today I'm going to be speaking with Jason Carroll and Jenet Jacob Erickson. Jenet is on the faculty here at Religious Education at BYU, but they both are working very closely with the Wheatley Institute's efforts to research and disseminate the research that's being done on family. So Jason, Jenet, thank you for being with me.
So good to be here.
Thanks, Brad.
I've heard it said that young people today, as they're considering marriage, are facing a perfect storm. What are the elements that are creating that kind of storm for young people as they look toward having a family?
I think, Brad, for a long time, we could see the effects of divorce and the challenges of non-marital childbearing, and we're concerned about children. And now I think what's happening is we're still concerned about children, but we are even more concerned, if you can be, with the fact that we have this dramatic decrease in people, young adults and adults, entering into the core relationships of marriage and family life. And that means there's just increased risk for alienation, loneliness, disconnection, mental health troubles, all of those things. So when we look at adolescence, we can see, as you described, kind of this perfect storm of challenges that seem to be precluding the capacity to enter and form these strong relationships. That means we've had this extended adolescence where they're not taking on adult roles. There's like 10-year, what we'll call the 10-year decade of me, that's go sow all your wild oats, get everything out of you, because settling down is going to really hamper your life. And in that period, they're still sexually pairing up, even though they're not marrying, and that's going to have implications for the kinds of relationships and stability that we can have in the future. We have decreased emotional resilience. I think we're all familiar with the fact that there's tremendous increase in anxiety, depression, internationally among adolescents, it appears clearly linked, at least in some degree, to social media use and technology use. We see a decrease in parents orienting their children toward marriage, almost like there's a sense of ambivalence about caring about that, parents seeing that for their children's future and valuing that. Decreased religiousness, we've seen that kind of ubiquitously across our United States culture. And so all of these things are contributing to, I think, what we might identify as a crisis in identity and meaning and purpose. And it's bound up in the fact that there isn't a clear pathway into marriage and family and children.
I think one of the things we want to emphasize is that when we look at these trends, we always want to understand that inside of them, we see real evidence that young people continue to have really high levels of aspiration for marriage and family life. They report that it's a top life goal. It's something that they deeply desire in life. But some of these patterns are causing them to have low expectations. So high aspirations, low expectations, a bit of discouragement about whether or not that can be real for them. Kind of the idea of, is it within my reach? And so we see a pattern where the distinction of helping them move towards. Now, we always want to highlight with these trends, too, we've seen an increase of the number of young people with some struggles and challenges here, but we also continue to see a number that do remarkably well. So we're always looking at big trends, right? These overall trends and patterns. But then we always, what we call at Wheatley, the Wheatley Institute, we refer to them as the positive outliers. Often we don't draw as much attention to those that are the counter trends. And sometimes because of that, I don't think young people hear enough of the good news. They don't hear enough of the where things are going well, and particularly what are choices and decisions they could make that'll actually help them be more likely to be a part of the good news rather than just getting caught in some of these challenging trends.
I can see where they're coming from because, we see in the newspaper these charts that show unmarried births in the United States, and it's just like up, 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 up. And then we see the decline in marriage, and we see down, 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 down. And so I think if we're not careful, we can get overwhelmed by that. But I think if we can focus on some of the positive things that are happening, then maybe we can help young people be able to fulfill these aspirations that they're feeling.
I think the important thing to capture is that these aren't just patterns of the past, right? Sometimes it feels like, that pathway of marriage and family and enduring marriage, and those patterns are
something bygone, of a bygone
something
era.
of a bygone era. So the pointing to the positive outliers, as I referred to them, in the current context helps, I think, create confidence and hope that it's happening now. And there are many that are doing it. And the overall trend never tells the full story because there's always those, as I said before, those counter trends inside of that.
One thing that worried me was when I was reading one of the reports from Wheatley that talks about the state of our unions, capstones versus cornerstones. Is marrying later always better? I think there are some ideas of people saying, hey, it is better to marry later. Explain to us a little bit about what that research is showing.
Well, whenever we talk about the benefits of marriage delay, we're actually starting to have an outdated conversation about this, right? A generation or so ago, the conversation about age of marriage was really around teenage marriage, right? And data has shown pretty uniformly that delay of marriage, getting it out of the teenage years, is a good thing, right? So that's what experts call first order delay, from the teens to the 20s. That's been uniformly positive, pretty good thing to get more stable, more established. But now in the United States today, only about 3% of marriages are teenage marriages. It's an outdated conversation. That's not really what we see happening very much anymore. But what we're seeing now is a different trend. Now it's what experts call second order delay, which is the movement of marriage from the 20s to the 30s.
Almost like the assumption was the longer and longer you delay, the better and more strong that marriage is going to be. And
it's a key myth, right? It's a key myth in our dating culture. Older is better. what the data really shows us as far as age is that once we get out of those teenage years, age really isn't a very good predictor of marriage outcomes anymore, right? And that's because chronological age, biological age, once you get into young adulthood and beyond, it's not a very good predictor of maturational age. We live in a culture today where many 24-year-olds are more mature than 44-year-olds, right? It's other factors that predict the outcome of a relationship and of a marriage. But what's happening with this second order delay, like Jenet referred to before, we have a culture that's not delaying sexual coupling. So there's still sexual coupling in their late teens and early 20s at the same time their great-grandparents did. Great-grandparents did it in the context of marriage, but today we don't have that. So now we're starting to have all of these issues of not just a delay of marriage into the 30s, but a resequencing of marriage, right? Where childbirth is coming outside of marriage. For many people, marriage delayed becomes marriage foregone, right? And so we start to see unintended consequences coming from that second order delay. And then the big one we're paying attention to now is the real big decline in fertility. We see less families, less children. That's going to start to have some pretty big impacts in our society and our culture. So that second order delay is a very different phenomenon than what we talked about in the past.
I've actually had young people come to me and say, I went to my parents, and these are young people here at BYU who are in the church, and they say, I went to my parents and told them that I'm really getting close to this boy, or I'm getting really close to this girl, and I'm considering engagement. And their parents are saying, no, not until you're 30.
Brad, I think it's so interesting when David Brooks, who writes for the New York Times and would be seen as a left-leaning writer, he saw the data just in the last few months of parents suggesting that 90% really valued their children becoming financially independent and financially secure. And then on the flip, it was only 20%, a little more than 20%, that said they had the same important value placed on their children marrying and having children. So he's responding to this, and he's seeing the decrease in interest around marriage from parents and also the decreased marriage rate. And he was so anxious about it. He said, I want to grab them by the lapels and just say, don't we realize that these core relationships are like the wellspring from which goodness comes in your life? And this is a man who had a crisis in his own life. He finds himself divorced, alone in an apartment, on the brink of receiving the highest honors of his life. And he can see none of this matters. I'm alone. I haven't eaten with people in days, in months. And so he ends up having his own transformation. He writes his next book, right, The Second Mountain, which is about what in life really matters. And so it's almost like he's taken it upon himself as his mission to say, we have to care about marriage, these core relationships, young adults thinking about that early so that it becomes, and he's describing this, the cornerstone of your life, that together in the fragility and the vulnerability of life, you are bound together to do this work together. And it just shapes everything, how you do financially, how the meaning that you have in your life, the well-being in your connection to your community, your connection to political things. And we just know it really is meant to be a cornerstone in one's life, not kind of the icing on the cake after you've established yourself independently. It plays such a powerful role in integrating us, building us, strengthening us.
I read that article. It's called To Be Happy, Marriage Matters More Than Career. And he actually comes out and says, there are many reasons you may not find marital happiness in your life, but don't let it be because you didn't prioritize marriage. Don't let it be because you didn't think hard about marriage when you were young.
Powerful.
Brad, that very situation you talked about with parents and where do they emphasize that? The capstones versus cornerstones report that we did at Wheatley, we wanted to look at exactly that, right? So that whole study compared early marriages that begin when the spouses are in 20 to age 24, right, which is increasingly being said that's an early marriage. And we compared them then to couples that start their marriages later, right? Now, of course, marital timing isn't always a matter of choice. I always emphasize that cornerstone marriage in some cases might influence the timing of a marriage, but first and foremost, cornerstone marriage is a condition of our hearts. We put it at the cornerstone of the life and values that we have, regardless of when the actual timing occurs. But to take on that idea that those early marriages are somehow disadvantaged, that's a bad way to start, we compared them, and across the board, those marriages in the early and mid-20s look just as strong, just as stable, and in some ways even more satisfied and happy than later marriages. In fact, one of the research findings the last few years that people don't know about is that age of marriage actually has a curvilinear relationship with marriage outcomes and divorce possibility. It's high, as I said, in those teenage years. It comes down. The lowest is during those 20-something years. New data shows us that in the 30s, and particularly after 35, when people are supposedly the most prepared, the most ready, stable, financial, careers, we start to see the divorce probability start to go back up, right? So there's a way there. My biggest message to most people about age of marriage, particularly when parents or others are saying, oh, until you're 25, until you're 30, there's really no evidence to support that after we get out of those teenage years. I've been in the marriage prediction business for a long time now as far as research, right? If I had to predict the outcome of a marriage, and I can only do it with 10 factors or 20 factors, as long as I'm outside of that teenage time period, I'm not picking age. It's not one of the factors I'm going to pick to maximize my prediction, because age just doesn't matter as much as some of the other factors we know that really are quite important.
Jason, you mentioned subgroups. You talked about groups that are kind of going against this trend. Tell me a little bit more about what those subgroups are doing and what you're seeing, not as you look at the overall numbers, which we've been discussing, that can get very discouraging. Most of our listeners have probably stopped listening by now because they're all ready to just go lock themselves in the closet and cry. What are the subgroups doing that you're starting to see that's bucking this trend?
So I think a way to do it is you think about the factors. Okay, you think about what we know to be the factors, and then as you pull them together, as you group them, the more you have a constellation of those factors, the more and more resilient a marriage tends to be. The starting point here is to make sure that young people really understand that things like a divorce rate is not uniform. I've been teaching the marriage preparation courses here at BYU now for 16 years, right? And I'll ask the students, how many of you have heard this idea that there's a 50% divorce rate? All of their hands go up. And they've all interpreted that oftentimes to mean, so my marriage in the future is a 50-50 coin toss. I tell them, if that is true, you have my complete permission to freak out and lock yourself in the closet, right? That's a really scary idea or thought. But the simple reality is divorce rates are not uniform. Some marriages are very, very fragile, and others are very resilient. And we've been spending a lot of time in the research trying to learn what are the factors that make a relationship more resilient, more likely to endure, more likely to be happy, to be flourishing, and which are the ones that make relationships pretty fragile. Because the simple truth is, not all marriages are created equally. They come together with different foundations, different histories, different patterns, right? And they engage with different interactions, have different priorities, all sorts of things that change their course. And so we've been trying to identify those really resilient, really flourishing marriages. And the great news is the factors that most predict are agentive. They're things that people can choose. This isn't something you're going to find out that you have it or you don't. These are things that you can make choices and decisions and priorities and bring these things into your life and greatly increase your likelihood of having a loving and lasting marriage.
If you're interested in more high-quality gospel scholarship, check out BYU's Religious Study Center, your lifelong resource for gospel scholarship. Established in 1975 under the direction of then Dean Jeffrey R. Holland, The RSC was designed to encourage, sponsor, and publish serious, faithful, gospel-related materials to promote a greater understanding of the gospel of Jesus Christ and its importance in the lives of Latter-day Saints. You can access many free gospel resources, including Come Follow Me videos, supplemental readings, digital copies of The Religious Educator, and even many books. Learn more by visiting rsc.byu.edu. We've been listening to Drs. Erickson and Carroll help us understand important insights about marriage. In Part 2, we continue the discussion and learn what research suggests are practical ways to prepare for and maintain healthy marriages.
What can we do about this? Not just what does the research say, but what can we do? Why does this matter to us? If you were going to speak to young people and their parents, what would be some actual things that they could focus on that would improve their chances of having this resilient marriage that you're talking about?
This is such a gift to talk about these factors. I think one thing that's been powerful to see is the blessing of religion in both inclining us toward religion, to marriage and family and core relationships, and helping us develop the characteristics and virtues that enable that marriage to thrive. So it's really beautiful to just see that across the world, this is a study out of Wheatley, the happiest marriages were highly religious marriages where people are practicing their religious faith. And almost as if bringing God into your life, even as a young person. I think about growing up in primary, for example, in our church, and we've had other churches come and say, what are you doing to facilitate marriage so much? Like, your young people are getting married. How are you doing that? And that takes going back to primary. When you're singing about an eternal family and you're thinking about marriage, then you enter young women and you have activities with young men, but they're not dating relationships. It's you learning to understand the opposite sex and interact. And then we're guided into dating in groups, and then eventually dating exclusively and keeping sexual intimacy reserved for marriage. And these beautiful patterns that are guided by our religious faith. And at the core of it is this truth that we come from a mother and a father who are married, and that this eternal plan of Christ is to enable us to become at one with him and with one another in our marriages. And so when we're bound together with our religious faith and the practices that help establish and kindle the fruits of that faith in our lives, then there's hardly anything else more powerful in terms of marriage.
Yeah, two things, and it's so beautifully said. We have primary witnesses, right? Inside of the gospel of Jesus Christ, we have the spiritual witness and the teaching of living prophets and scriptures that give us the primary witness of these truths that Jenet's talking about. But we also have in the research what I like to call second witnesses, right? We, in a study that Jenet just mentioned, we did a study in 11 countries with 16,000 people looking at the impacts of religious practice on marriage and family life. Most studies only look at whether people attend church, right? You're highly religious if you go to church once a week. We went past that. Not just attenders, but what a group we called home worshipers, who actually were praying on a daily basis, reading scriptures regularly, having religious conversations in the home, praying together as families. We found that the benefits of religion in people's lives was 30 to 40% higher than most studies estimate. And all the studies have shown that highly religious, right? So that's a great starting factor. Our faith matters. Right? Religious practice matters. Those are more resilient, more enduring marriages.
And that is so comforting for every mom and dad out there that is just convinced that their kids are not even listening when they're doing family scripture study. And every mom and dad out there that's saying, my gosh, why do we try to have family prayer? The kids just sit there and giggle and laugh and stab each other with forks under the table. But that is so fascinating to me. One, that in a world where they say religion has negative effects, you're telling me that religion actually has positive effects. And that's just in studies that are looking at the religious attendance. Do you go to church? But now you're saying that come follow me makes a difference.
Marital quality, emotional closeness in marriage, sexual satisfaction in marriage. Here's one. how about this one to change the narrative on this? The idea is often, those religious marriages, those aren't very good for women, right? That's where men are in charge. They're oppressive. The highest level of shared decision-making in marriage is among highly religious, home-worshiping couples. In fact, the group that does the best are women in highly religious marriages. Right? They look so different than women who have less religious participation or no religious participation at all. So it is an understanding that that is a key part of it. The other thing that Jenet mentioned too, though, the practices of the gospel safeguard us, right? We did a study last year that we released. How about this understanding? If a person says that their spouse is their only sexual partner in life, so they've lived a pattern of chastity and they've saved that for marriage, the data shows that couples with that factor, you can add other factors, but that factor alone has about a 5% chance of divorce in the first 5 years of marriage. If a person enters marriage with 2 or more lifetime partners, it's about a 30% chance, right? See what I mean by resilient versus more fragile? That pattern of sexual restraint, that pattern of chastity is actually, in the social science research, one of the strongest predictive things you can do. And of course, whenever we teach this, we always emphasize if we've made some choices or decisions that aren't on path, the beauty of the atonement of Christ and the beauty of repentance is he can restore all those things to us, not just spiritually, but I deeply believe even in what we see in the research, because changed hearts and changed minds will still have the blessings of the original trajectory, right? But those are things that we don't think about, that by living those kinds of patterns, we actually safeguard ourselves and help create a more resilient, loving, lasting marriage in the future.
So religiosity makes a difference. Also, living the law of chastity makes a difference. So we can say to young people, you want to have a stronger marriage later? Live the law of chastity now, which flies in the face of conventional wisdom of pop culture that says, oh, yeah, you wouldn't buy a car without test driving it. You should have these sexual experiences to make sure you're compatible with your spouse. That's something we have heard for decades now.
That's why the title of our report, and make sure for everyone listening, they can go on to the Wheatley Institute website. All of these reports are available for them to read and to look at with summaries and the graphs and the data. We called that report The Myth of Sexual Experience, because whether it's sexual experience with multiple partners, whether it's testing sexual chemistry early in a relationship, living together before marriage, all of those are known, identified risk factors of a more fragile marriage. They don't act as a test drive. They don't act as a strengthening mechanism, but the culture says that they do. They're myths. They're myths, and it's not just the data that tells us that. Of course, we go back to those primary truths, and we see they're reflecting the truths that prophets have taught us both anciently and today.
Jenet, what's something else that young people can do? We've talked about 2. Stay strong in your religious conviction. Mm-hmm. Bring religion and God into your marriage. Mm-hmm. We've talked about living the law of chastity, communicating to your future spouse that you can be trusted by showing your future spouse that you're not going to break the law of chastity even with him or her because you love him or you love her. Mm-hmm. Being able to say, no, I'm going to live this commitment, and then you can trust me after we're married that I will continue to live this commitment. Yes. So here we've got 2 things that are very important for building a resilient marriage. So Jenet, what else is there that a young person can do to have a more resilient marriage?
I think it's powerful that we're seeing what we call the success sequence across the board that just says it's better for your life trajectory, financially, well-being, stability in marriage, if you seek an education, all the education you can, then marry, then have children. Now, I don't think that means you delay marriage while you're getting your PhD per se, right? But it's an orientation towards preparing oneself, and that education is valuable and it facilitates stability and awareness and skills and capacities. So an orientation towards education is important, and the sequencing of those priorities. So there's just risk if people don't graduate from high school and they have children outside of marriage. That's a really difficult trajectory, both for your own life and as an adult and for the children that come into that relationship.
Does it matter if you get the degree before you get married or after you get married? Like my mom went back to school and got a degree after. Is there any difference?
The research does not show a difference in terms of getting the degree before, getting the degree after. There's stability associated with college education, but it's an orientation towards developing your life, pursuing all that you can, and doing things in an order that facilitates strength and stability.
It's a cornerstone idea, right?
It's a cornerstone
we're back
idea.
to cornerstone being much, much more than just the timing. It's putting it at the cornerstone of our hearts. And then everything we do ties to that, right?
I just had a student in class. He was talking to someone as I asked a question, and I wasn't part of the conversation, but I could overhear him say that marriage, he's married, he said, marriage has gotten me off the couch, deeply caring about his pre-med orientation. He's trying to get into medical school. And he could see right off how much it has changed his sense of importance about what he's doing today at BYU. And so for men in particular, it's like it transforms their sense of, I've got people who are going to be depending on me. I got to work hard. I've got to pursue all the education I can, become able to earn, because these people that I love and committed to, they need me. I can't be less than my best. So I loved just hearing him say. The other big piece, Brad, is we've got this major issue with technoference, and it's interfering in marriages. We can see that, the need to put aside phones, to actually look into one another's eyes and see and connect. It's just so, that phone, it does everything, right? So the moment we pick it up, I got to figure out that and that and that, and we find that it's interfering with our ability to connect. That is what is a predictor actually of children experiencing problems from social media use, is how much their parents are using it, interestingly enough. But when we think about just an adolescent developing relationship skills, that the energy is to just not do anything, is to pull into one's phone and engage that way. We are so relational by nature. In the broader world, we'll say we're social animals. We need touch. We need eye to eye. We need to be with people. And that we are not flourishing human beings unless that is met. And so I think that's why in-person activities, that's why young women and young men programs, that every week to have an activity where you're in touch with people and families praying together and hugging one another and setting aside phones. We know that parents play a very powerful role in helping their children set boundaries around the use of technology and helping them develop the discipline to know how to use that well. But just an orientation towards being present. That's why church is, right, ministering and fulfilling your callings and attending and being with one another actually facilitates our ability to marry and have core relationships that will shape our lives.
And how many wives are so frustrated when their husbands are spending their whole time playing video games?
Yes.
And how many husbands are frustrated when their wives are so engulfed with social media that they are getting all of their social needs met through the phone rather than through a husband. So I think you're right. That's one thing we can all do better, is to take charge of technology so that the technology is not interfering with real relationships now and later.
Yes.
One thing I think we can add to this too, Brad, is just one of the big concerns is that as marriage is seen as later and later in the life course, and parents perhaps not emphasizing it as much to their children, what gets lost is any sense of intentional preparation, right? Think of what young people today, teenagers and young adults, right? What is it that parents, I don't know about you, I live in a neighborhood where it's like every girl on the street is being prepared to be a professional dancer, right? It's hours and hours of dance, and every young man is going to be a professional athlete, and everybody in the drama club at school is doing that year round. I mean, think of the things that we're doing, and of course, some talent development and activities we know to be really positive and really helpful. But if the horizon, right, we call this a marital horizon, if the marital horizon gets pushed too far down the line, right, we start to lose a sense that we should be actively, intentionally preparing and helping young people prepare. So we know that things like learning more about relationship skills, understanding communication, how to resolve conflict, how do you manage differences with someone, right? There's a lot that's out there that we can learn, but we have to intentionally look for it because we don't really have it built into our schools, and it's really parents and church and others. The other thing that the research is showing, there's been this new movement in what we call marital virtues. One of the strongest predictors of relationships that last and do well is that they're made up of virtuous people. It sounds like a pretty simple idea, but if you want a good marriage, right, good marriages are made up of good people. So as you strive to be someone who is kind, someone who can forgive, someone who's generous, someone who's fair and does their fair share, right? All of us know this at the university. Announce to the class that you have group projects and you get a bunch of moaning and groaning, right? Because people are afraid they're going to get put in a group that's someone who doesn't do their fair share. Teaching young people, right, and young people themselves committing to, I can live these virtues. And this can all happen long before marriage, long before even in the dating process as we strive to become a virtuous person, practice virtues, and of course in the light of the gospel, to be endowed even more fully through the atonement of Christ with those divine attributes and virtues. That makes a real difference, that when we get to the point of navigating a relationship and managing the ups and downs that happen in all marriages and the challenges that come to families, to be virtuous, knowledgeable people that know how to think about relationships in those intentional, thoughtful ways. We've got to get away from a culture that's only intentional preparation for a career,
as an autonomous person. Right?
Yeah, or maybe preparation for a hobby or my activity. People spend hours and hours developing their skills in these ways, and we often don't have very specific, targeted ways to learn more and become better at relationships. And we know we can. There are skills we can learn. There are things that we can be more aware of that can help each of us be just a better family member and a better spouse in the future.
I appreciate this list of practical things that we can do, but then I start feeling a little overwhelmed. I start thinking, I've got to do this and this and this and this. And with that in mind, let's talk about how it really is worth it. It's worth it to do these things, to be religious, to live the law of chastity, to be intentional about developing these qualities, putting away our social media, investing in relationships. And we talked about living the law of chastity and getting education. Well, that starts being a pretty long list. And I guess the only thing we can say is it really is worth it. I'd like to turn now for a moment to the research you've been involved with, Jenet, on the Utah family miracle and why it matters. I think that's what can give us the motivation to do these things that will give us a more resilient marriage. You say here, perhaps the Beehive State is best known for its top rankings on the economic front, and people call it the Utah economic miracle. Utah's economy ranks number 1 among all 50 states, according to U.S. News and World Report. Then it says here, while Utah's sky-high economic performance has gotten a lot of attention, the state has also gotten high marks when it comes to happiness. Utah is in the top 10 states for emotional well-being, and Gallup ranked Utah as number 1 for emotional health. We're seeing that economic and happiness miracle, and tell us how that links with the family values that are in Utah.
Yeah, thank you, Brad. It's pretty amazing. No state in the union has as many men, women, and children in married households as does our state, the Beehive State. There is something very powerful about what happens when men and women come together to nurture life in families that builds human capital in an economic term, that builds strength, that builds the core capacities that lead to strong economies. It's interesting that they'll say that Utah County has the highest percentage of children with married parents. So being raised by two married parents as anywhere in the nation by much higher percentages. And we just know it's very powerful for building strength among those children and in the community. So Raj Chetty, now at Stanford, looked at what is it that predicts people coming out of poverty. So we call that upward mobility. He found that a key factor, if not the primary factor, is the percentages of marriages in a community. So whether or not someone actually is in a marriage, just being around marriages in a community where there are married families is the strongest predictor of coming up out of poverty.
So you're saying that a single mother then in Utah, instead of feeling out of place
Yes.
and feeling like, gosh, I'm surrounded by these stronger marriages,
Yes.
I need to go somewhere else where I can fit in reality, that single mom or that single dad is right where they should be, surrounded by strong and stable homes.
Yes, it is very strengthening. And it's almost like what happens when you have married parents is there's obviously increased stability. Just marriage itself increases stability for children. It increases the likelihood that you have someone else to partner with in the demands of family life and someone to check on you. So it's strengthening the quality of parenting in married families. And then you pull together economically. There's just something incredibly powerful about two people working together, pulling all that they can into the center of that home that builds economic strength and stability and resources. Nothing really compares to it. There's no institution that does what marriage does when we look at economic, human capital, flourishing, strength of children.
So the research is actually showing then, if I'm understanding you right, that the economic development in Utah is dependent on the family
Yes.
situation.
Yes.
Wow.
Yes, even the creativity, entrepreneurship is actually linked to stable families. Utah has a high amount of that, and of course, the economic policies facilitate that, but it really does go down to those core relationships being strong and stable.
If you're interested in reading The Utah Family Miracle and the other research studies we've been discussing, you can find them in the show notes and on our website, whyreligion.byu.edu. I also recommend you go back and listen to episode 48 on Why Religion for Professor Erickson's podcast on the complementary nature of mothers and fathers. But for now, it's time for our last segment, part 3, where we get a little more personal. Here, Jenet and Jason talk about their own families and share how their testimonies of Jesus Christ have influenced them.
I'd like to get a little more personal, if that's okay. I mean, I'm sitting here listening to the two of you talk, and I recognize that I've got two experts on marriage and family right here. And I start feeling like, wow, your homes must be perfect. Your marriages must be perfect. Tell us a little bit about your own family situation and what you're doing to make that work, and how your testimonies of the gospel, your testimonies of the restoration, your testimonies of Jesus Christ and his atonement have made a difference in your own lives.
I'll jump in. Maybe start with my starting point. As I had finished my graduate school training and was doing all the statistics and all the research and all these things, when I was hired at BYU 23 years ago now, I was actually hired into a position that was created to teach a new Proclamation on the Family course, right? And I count that in the experience of teaching that course, Eternal Families, the Marriage Preparation course, that have all been classes that have wonderful blending of the principles and doctrines of the gospel together with these insights from relationship sciences. I just count it as a tremendous blessing in my life. I feel like it gave me such a better balance to think about these primary witnesses and secondary witnesses that are there. I have told my students through the years, I don't teach them a single principle, a single idea that I haven't personally benefited from and continue to benefit from, right? We've talked about a lot of things that, like we said, maybe can feel a little overwhelming. This all needs realistic expectations, right? Marriage and family is God's part of the plan to help us become what we're supposed to become. It's a trajectory. It's a becoming. It's a creating of these things. It's not a final destination. It's a journey of that. And it has just been the sweetest to be able to share with students those growth experiences and areas that I've seen growth in my own marriage, in my own parenting. I'm now in the context of launching my kids. My youngest is a senior in high school. I've got 2 young grandsons. I'm kind of in that whole launching part of life. But the thing I think I would want to share with everyone listening was, over the years, I can't even begin to pull together how many times I have had the confirming witness of the Spirit fill a classroom, fill my heart, fill our conversations as we're talking about principles of the proclamation on the family. It really is a blueprint towards loving and lasting marriages and enduring families. It's a beautiful gift from our Father in heaven in a time when the trends may be a bit alarming, to know that here's a blueprint. We don't have to go it alone. We don't have to figure it out. We just have to trust that it's His institution. It's His. Trust that pattern. And it's just been a very deeply enriching experience. And I'm so grateful to have the daily opportunity to bear witness of those truths and to see testimonies grow around that.
I'm so grateful to hear. I love hearing Jason talk about that. I feel like growing up in the gospel, I inherited an appreciation for those truths. But I got to say that when I got married and had children, I couldn't believe what a failure I was. I couldn't believe I had all these beautiful ideals. And it was as if, as Jason was alluding to, it was like marriage and family was exposing me to the realities, to the weaknesses, to the inability in myself. And I think most profoundly in my experiences, we have a Redeemer who came to walk this path with us, whose grace is infinite. And that it's almost as if He says, just come show me your weakness. I'm here. This is going to expose you to it. And there will be fracturing in life. Some of us, I wrestled with infertility, was single a long time. All of us will have unfulfilled yearnings in family life as we try to live out these principles of truth and exercise faith in them. We are not here to win. I don't think we're here to win. I think we're here to know Him and His redeeming power. And it's almost as if in the effort and the failure, we can't help but just be so astounded by a merciful God who came to live our experience with us, who knows what it feels like to be impatient as a mother, to struggle with infertility, to struggle with finding someone to marry, to struggle with a marriage that ends, to not be able to help with abuse, to not stop it, to find all that you can do is leave the marriage. He's walked every single one of those paths and has assured us that through His atonement, we are all eternally blessed with deep, profound, connected, eternal relationships. That is the promise. He will bring at-one-ment in our lives and to our relationships. And so in this journey of trying, so grateful for the truths, knowing we will fail, we will be imperfect, we will need Him, and He will be right beside us, endowing us with the power that we need to fill the cracks in our lives, fill the cracks in our relationships, and ensure us eternal life together as we so hope for.
Thanks for listening to Why Religion. This podcast is a production of Religious Education at Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. My name is John Hilton, the host and producer. The Why Religion podcast team also includes from BYU Religious Education, Professors Jenet Erickson, Casey Griffiths, Jared Halverson, Travis Searle, Ryan Sharp, Hank Smith, and Brad Wilcox. Promotional materials were created and distributed by Leanne Kopis and Katie King. Recording, mixing, and original music was done by BYU students Alec Galloway and Ethan Arkell. Original music and scoring for the Why Religion podcast was also created by the fabulous BYU student musicians Grant Cagle,
Sam Clausen,
Colette Jones,
Alistair Scheuermann,
If you enjoy what you've heard, please like and subscribe to Why Religion and leave us a rating. This really helps others discover the podcast. And join us next time as we continue to bring the everyday Latter-day Saint fascinating gospel studies done by BYU religion professors to enlighten your mind and strengthen your faith in Jesus Christ.